Betrayed, Divorced, Reborn, a man's journey to freedom. Greg Watson believed in routine. Wake up at 6, shower, pour a cup of coffee, kiss his wife goodbye, and endure another grueling day at Randall and Company. Marketing. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was steady, dependable. He always liked that about himself, his reliability. He was the kind of man who kept his promises. The kind of man who worked hard, came home on time, and loved his wife without question. That's why, when he woke up that Monday morning with a dull ache in his lower abdomen, he brushed it off. Probably something he ate. He had never been one to get sick, and besides, the last thing he needed was to fall behind at work. Marissa was already in the bathroom, blow-drying her hair. Through the half-open door, he could see her reflection in the mirror, her sharp, elegant features carefully made up, her silky dark hair cascading over her shoulders. She was stunning, even after 15 years of marriage. "Morning," he murmured, stepping inside. She barely glanced at him. "Morning," she replied coolly, her eyes fixated on her own reflection. Lately, she'd been distant, maybe even cold. She had always been ambitious, throwing herself into her work as a real estate agent, but something had shifted in the last year. The late nights at the office, the urgent weekend showings, the text messages she would tuck her phone away to answer. He told himself he was imagining things. Marissa wasn't the type to cheat. Shaking off the nagging thoughts, he dressed quickly and headed downstairs. His two daughters, Lisa and Ginger, were already at the kitchen table, half awake and picking at their cereal. "Dad, we need money for the school trip," Lisa mumbled. Greg grabbed his wallet and handed her a 20. "What's the trip for again?" Lisa sighed. "Dad, I told you like 5 times. The Science Museum." Greg smirked. "Well, you know me, my brain's not as sharp in the morning." She rolled her eyes but smiled. That was enough to make him feel like things were still normal. Marissa breezed into the kitchen, grabbing her designer handbag off the counter. She was wearing a sleek navy blue dress, the kind she only pulled out when she really wanted to impress someone. "Big day?" Greg asked, sipping his coffee. She smiled, tight-lipped, forced. "Just another showing." Then she was gone. No kiss goodbye, no lingering glance. Just the click of her heels fading down the hallway and the slam of the front door. Greg's stomach twisted. That ache was getting worse. By the time Greg arrived at the office, his discomfort had worsened. It wasn't just a dull ache anymore. It was a sharp, burning pain. Every step he took felt like a fresh sting, like needles scraping against raw skin. He tried to focus on his emails, but within an hour, the pain was unbearable. Sweat beaded at his forehead. His legs bounced under the desk as he debated whether to call a doctor. Then came the moment that sent pure panic through him. When he went to the restroom, what he saw made his blood run cold. A sickly greenish discharge. His hands gripped the sink. He felt dizzy. What the hell was happening? He had never had an STD before. Hell, he had only ever been with one woman. His wife. It hit him all at once. The late nights. The secretive phone calls. The distance. And now this? A knock on the door jolted him back to reality. His boss, Alan Randall, peered in. "Greg, you okay?" Greg straightened, forcing a weak smile. "Yeah, just, feeling a little off today." Alan frowned. "You look like hell. Go to a doctor, man. Whatever it is, you don't want it getting worse." Greg nodded, but his mind was already spinning. Minutes later, he was in his car, gripping the wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. As he pulled into the parking lot of an urgent care clinic, only one thought repeated in his mind. This can't be happening. But it was. The clinic smelled like antiseptic and cheap air freshener. Greg sat stiffly in the exam room, his heart pounding as the doctor, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an efficient demeanor, read his test results. "Mr. Watson," she said, looking up from the chart, "your results came back positive for gonorrhea." The words didn't register at first. They hung in the air, foreign and surreal. Greg blinked. That's not possible. The doctor gave him a level look. Have you been sexually active outside your marriage? No, he said instantly. Never. Her expression didn't change. Then you need to have a conversation with your wife. Greg felt like he was sinking. The room was too bright, too sterile, too small. He had been faithful, absolutely faithful, which meant one thing. Marissa had not. The drive to his parents' house felt longer than usual. Greg's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than they needed to, his knuckles white against the black leather. He kept replaying the doctor's words in his mind, each syllable slicing into him like a freshly sharpened knife. The word itself was repulsive, like something that belonged in whispered rumors about reckless teenagers, not in his own, seemingly stable, marriage of 16 years. Greg pulled into the driveway of his childhood home, a modest brick house with navy blue shutters, the front porch still adorned with the same wind chimes his mother had hung years ago. The soft, tinkling sound usually brought him comfort. Not today. The second he stepped inside, the familiar scent of butter pecan coffee filled his nose. His father, Dan Watson, stood by the kitchen counter, pouring a fresh cup, his silver hair slightly disheveled from a morning of reading the newspaper. His mother, Evelyn, was at the table, flipping through a stack of mail. Dan looked up. Greg, what are you doing here this early? Greg opened his mouth to speak, but his throat tightened. He wasn't sure how to say it. How do you tell your parents that your wife, the mother of their grandchildren, had betrayed you in the worst possible way? Evelyn, always perceptive, set down the mail and stood. Honey, what's wrong? Greg swallowed hard. He hadn't cried yet, hadn't even allowed himself to process it. But standing in the house where he'd grown up, where love and loyalty were the only things that mattered, it hit him like a punch to the gut. I have gonorrhea, he said finally. The words came out flat, hollow. A thick silence fell over the room. The only sound was the distant ticking of the old wooden clock on the wall. His mother's face paled. Oh, Greg. Dan set his coffee cup down carefully, his expression unreadable. Son, have you been unfaithful? His voice wasn't accusatory, just firm. Greg's head snapped up. No, never. His father studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Then I believe you. Greg exhaled, only now realizing he had been holding his breath. He could feel the weight of his mother's gaze, her hands clasped in front of her mouth as if she were holding back words she didn't want to say. Evelyn broke the silence first. That means Marissa. She stopped herself, as if saying it out loud would make it too real. Greg nodded stiffly. Yeah, it means she cheated on me. His mother sank into the chair. Oh, honey. Dan's jaw tightened, and he crossed his arms over his chest. Have you confronted her? Not yet. I just found out this morning. His father nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. So, what's your next move? Greg ran a hand down his face, the roughness of his unshaven stubble grounding him for a brief second. I don't know. I mean, I know I can't stay with her, but I have to think about Lisa and Ginger. They don't deserve this. Evelyn reached across the table and took his hand in hers, her grip warm and steady. You're right. But Greg, you deserve better than this. She didn't just betray you. She put your health at risk. That's not love. Greg's throat tightened. His mother had always been the emotional one, the nurturer, the one who could take a scraped knee and turn it into a life lesson about resilience. He knew she was right, but knowing it and accepting it were two different things. Dan stood abruptly and disappeared into his office. Greg frowned but didn't ask. When his father returned, he held out a small business card. Gina Hawkins, Dan said. She's a family law attorney, and she's from our church. I've known her for years. She's sharp. If you're serious about this, you should talk to her. Greg stared at the card, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. It felt too soon, too real. But what other choice did he have? After a long pause, he nodded. I'll call her. His father gave him a firm nod, his version of an embrace, while his mother reached out and squeezed his hand once more. We love you, Greg, and no matter what happens, we're here for you. For the first time that day, Greg felt a fraction of relief. But beneath it, the fire of betrayal still burned. And he knew this wasn't over. Greg sat stiffly in the dimly lit office of Gina Hawkins, the soft ticking of a wall clock the only sound between them. He had barely touched the coffee she had offered, his fingers drumming anxiously against the wooden armrest of his chair. Gina, a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-40s with a reputation for being ruthless in court, leaned forward, her gaze steady. "You did the right thing coming to me," she said. "But we need hard evidence before we file anything." Greg swallowed hard, still struggling to wrap his mind around it all. I just can't believe it. Marissa and I." He let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. "We were solid. Or at least, I thought we were." Gina nodded. "That's the thing about betrayal. It never announces itself." She picked up a sleek black pen and began jotting notes on a yellow legal pad. "Let's start with what we do know. She gave you an STD. You've never cheated on her. That means, unless she's been injected by the Holy Spirit himself, she's been unfaithful. The question now is, who and for how long?" Greg clenched his jaw. "I've noticed little things, her being distant, her staying late at work when she doesn't need to, the secret bank account." Gina's pen stopped mid-sentence. "Wait, secret bank account?" Greg nodded. "Yeah, a few weeks ago, I was doing our taxes and noticed money moving in and out of an account I didn't recognize. She's been receiving deposits, big ones, outside of her salary." Gina's brows lifted. "Who's paying her?" "I don't know, but I doubt it's from selling houses." She tapped the end of her pen against her notepad. "This changes things. There's a possibility she's not just cheating. She could be getting financially supported by this person." Greg felt the blood drain from his face. "You mean like a sugar daddy?" "It's possible. Or it could be something more subtle. Maybe it's a coworker paying her off to keep things quiet, a business deal gone wrong, or she's getting paid for something else entirely." Greg exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He didn't want to think about what that something else might be. "I need to know for sure," he muttered. "I need proof." Gina leaned back in her chair, tapping her nails against the desk in thought. Then, her lips curled into a knowing smirk. "I can recommend a private investigator. A damn good one." Greg hesitated. "Would that really help?" She arched a brow. "Well, you can always wait for your wife to burst through the door, tearfully confessing her sins. But if you'd rather know the truth now, we need surveillance." Greg exhaled. "All right, do it." As Gina picked up the phone to make arrangements, Greg absently reached for his own device, his thumb hovering over the screen. Then it hit him. Months ago, Marissa had misplaced her phone at a dinner party. In a moment of convenience, Greg had installed a tracker app so they could locate it easily. She had never bothered to delete it. His hands trembled as he pulled up the app, a small, pulsing dot marker location. She wasn't at work. She wasn't anywhere near her office. Greg's breath caught as he zoomed in on the map. She was across town, at a residential address he didn't recognize. He felt his stomach twist. It wasn't an office. It wasn't a cafe. It wasn't even a commercial property. It was a house. "Gina," he said, his voice tight. "I think I just found her." She leaned over the desk, glancing at his phone. A slow, knowing grin spread across her lips. "Looks like we won't have to wait long to see the truth." Greg stared at the screen, his pulse thundering in his ears. Who was waiting for Marissa in that house? And more importantly, what the hell was she doing there? Greg Watson had always believed in protecting his daughters from the harsh realities of the world. He never imagined that one day they would be the ones revealing a brutal truth to him. He sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee he had no intention of drinking. His mind was a swirling storm of betrayal, anger, and disbelief. He had spent the last few hours staring at the private investigator's initial findings, watching blurry photos of his wife in another man's arms. Now, his daughters were coming home. The sound of the front door opening jolted him back to the present. "Dad!" Lisa's voice echoed through the hallway. She and Ginger kicked off their shoes by the door, their backpacks thudding against the floor. Normally, Greg would remind them to be neater, But today, that was the last thing on his mind. He glanced at them, his daughters, his girls. Lisa, 15, with her sharp eyes and quick wit. Ginger, 13, quieter but no less perceptive. They had their mother's features, but Greg liked to think they had his sense of right and wrong. "Hey, Dad," Ginger said, dropping into a chair across from him. "You're home early." Lisa narrowed her eyes. "What's going on?" Greg hesitated. How much could he tell them? "I need you both to pack a bag," he said carefully. "You're going to stay with Grandma and Grandpa for a few days." Lisa crossed her arms. "Why?" Ginger frowned. "Is something wrong?" Greg opened his mouth, but Lisa spoke before he could. "You found out about Mom, didn't you?" The air in the room thickened. Greg's grip tightened around his coffee mug. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice steady but low. Lisa exchanged a glance with Ginger, who looked away, her face tense. Lisa took a deep breath. "I've heard Mom on the phone." Greg's stomach churned. "What do you mean?" "She talks to someone when she thinks we're asleep," Lisa said. "I don't know who, but she sounds different. Like how she talks to clients, except more flirty." Ginger bit her lip. "And she doesn't really care about us anymore," she mumbled. Greg's heart clenched. Lisa continued, her voice quieter now. "She doesn't ask about school. She forgets stuff, important stuff. And sometimes, when we try to talk to her, it's like she's not even listening." Ginger nodded. She used to at least pretend to care. Greg let out a slow breath. His daughters had noticed long before he did. Lisa's eyes flicked to him. "Dad, who is he?" Greg hesitated. He wasn't ready to give them all the details. Not yet. "I don't know everything," he admitted, which was only partly a lie. "But I promise you, I'll find out." Lisa studied him for a long moment. Then she exhaled sharply. "I knew it." Ginger suddenly looked nervous. "Dad, you're not going to leave us, right?" The question shattered him. Greg reached across the table, taking both their hands in his. "Never." A flicker of relief crossed Ginger's face, but Lisa was still tense. Then Greg pulled something from his pocket, a DNA test kit. Lisa stared at it. Her expression darkened. "Is that what I think it is?" Greg swallowed hard. "I just need to be sure." Lisa's jaw tightened. "You don't think we're really yours?" Ginger's eyes went wide. "Dad." Greg held up a hand. "It's not about you, too. I love you no matter what. But after everything," he trailed off, the words too painful to say aloud. Lisa looked away, her face unreadable. Then, after a long pause, she snatched the test from his hand and pulled out a swab. "Fine," she muttered. "Let's do this." Ginger hesitated, then took hers too. Greg watched as they each ran the swabs along the insides of their cheeks, sealing them in the provided envelopes. A lump formed in his throat. If these results came back wrong, it wouldn't change how he felt about his daughters. But it would change everything else. As they handed him the sealed swabs, Lisa met his gaze, her voice softer this time. "Dad." "Yeah. We're going to be okay, right?" Greg forced a smile, even as his world teetered on the edge of collapse. "Yeah, sweetheart," he whispered. "We'll be okay." Even if he didn't know how yet. The night was quiet except for the rhythmic tapping of Greg's fingers against his kitchen counter. He had barely eaten, barely slept. The past few days had been a whirlwind of revelations, each one hitting him harder than the last. But tonight, the truth would be undeniable. His phone vibrated. A message from Clayton Investigations. "We have confirmation. Meet us in 20 minutes. 1812, Redford Lane." Greg's breath hitched. He knew that address. It wasn't a hotel or some obscure meeting spot. It was a house. A house on the north side of town, where Marissa's GPS had pinged twice in the last week. He grabbed his keys, heart pounding in his chest like a war drum. The investigator, Marcus Clayton, was already waiting when Greg pulled up a block away. He was a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, dressed in a dark jacket that blended into the shadows. His SUV was parked inconspicuously across the street, camera equipment set up on the dashboard. Greg climbed into the passenger seat. His pulse quickened as Marcus wordlessly handed him a tablet. What he saw made his stomach churn. Marissa. She was in the driveway of the house, laughing, laughing, as she leaned into the arms of another man. Jake Reynolds. The same Jake Reynolds who had promoted her at work. The same Jake Reynolds who had mentored her in real estate. The same Jake Reynolds who had taken business trips to Chicago at the same time she had. Marissa's arms snaked around his neck, and Jake kissed her. Deeply, passionately. Greg's grip on the tablet tightened until his knuckles turned white. You sure you want to keep watching? Marcus asked. His voice was even, but Greg could sense the caution in it. Greg forced himself to nod. I need to see everything. The footage was crystal clear, shot from a long-range lens that captured every movement, every whispered conversation. They weren't just sneaking around in the dark. They were comfortable here. Like it was routine. Like it was home. The next clip showed them stepping inside. A hidden camera near the front window caught Marissa stripping off her blazer, tossing it onto the couch like she lived there. Jake disappeared into the kitchen, returning with 2 glasses of wine. You recognize this place? Marcus asked. Greg exhaled sharply. Yeah, I looked up the address on the county registry before I came here. It's owned by Jake's company, probably bought under a shell corporation. He's been keeping it off the books. Marcus nodded approvingly. Smart. Makes it harder for people to track, but not impossible. Greg stared at the screen, watching his wife, the mother of his children, laugh and drink and kiss another man in a house that was clearly meant for them. He felt sick. Marcus didn't say anything for a moment, letting the silence stretch between them. Finally, he asked, What do you want to do with this? Greg's jaw clenched. Send it all to my lawyer. The next morning, Gina Hawkins' office felt colder than usual. The blinds were drawn, the only light coming from a desk lamp that cast sharp shadows across the walls. Greg sat across from her, hands clasped so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. She tapped her pen against a folder. This is more than enough, Greg. You have her dead to rights. The video evidence, the bank records, the phone tracker logs, it's a slam dunk case for adultery. Greg's voice was tight. What does that mean for the divorce? Best case scenario, you get full custody, she gets limited visitation, and she walks away with less than she ever imagined. Greg let that sink in. She deserves worse. Gina sighed. I know how you feel, but the courts don't deal in revenge, Greg. They deal in facts. And right now, the facts are very much in your favor. Greg leaned forward, his eyes burning with something deeper than anger. What about Jake? Gina tilted her head. What about him? He's her boss. If their company has a morality clause in their contracts. Gina smiled. A slow, knowing smile. I'll look into it. Greg nodded, gripping the arms of his chair. The pieces were falling into place. Marissa had played him for a fool. She had risked his health, his dignity, his family, all for a sleazy office affair. But she had underestimated him. And now, he was going to take everything from her. Greg Watson sat in his dimly lit living room, the only sound in the house the rhythmic ticking of the clock above the fireplace. In front of him, on the coffee table, lay the evidence, photos, financial records, even a copy of his STD test. Proof of betrayal. Proof that the woman he had loved, the mother of his children, had shattered their marriage in ways he could never have imagined. His fingers drummed against the armrest of the couch. His daughters were staying at his parents' house for the night, giving him the space he needed to do what had to be done. The weight was suffocating. His phone buzzed. Marissa, be home in 10. Love you. Greg scoffed, the words so empty now they might as well be poison. Love. Was that what she called it? What kind of love drove a wife into the arms of another man for 2 years? What kind of love left her husband infected with another man's disease? The sound of the garage door rumbling open made his pulse quicken. His breath slowed as he steeled himself. The front door opened, and Marissa walked in, tossing her purse onto the counter like any other night. She hadn't even noticed the stack of damning evidence in plain view. She turned to him with her usual faux cheerful tone. Hey, babe, you're home early. Greg stayed silent. The weight of his stare must have unsettled her because she hesitated, eyes narrowing slightly. What's wrong? She asked. A slow exhale left Greg's lips. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, and pointed to the table. Take a look. She glanced down, confusion flickering across her face. Then, as her eyes scanned the photographs, asterisk her and Jake Reynolds of the Northside house, their lips pressed together, her hands tangled in his suit jacket, asterisk her breath hitched. Her fingers trembled as she flipped to the next image, her walking inside the house in broad daylight, looking over her shoulder, unaware that she was being watched. Then the next, a bank statement showing transfers from Jake's personal account into her secret one. She swallowed hard. Greg, I don't. His voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. How long? Marissa's lip quivered, and for a brief second, Greg saw something unfamiliar in her eyes, fear. Greg, please, let's just talk about this. He slammed his palm onto the table. I said, how long? She flinched. Silence stretched between them like a taut rope about to snap. Finally, she exhaled shakily. 2 years. Greg's head dropped slightly, his eyes closing. He had expected it, but hearing the words still felt like a knife to the gut. 2 years. 24 months of deceit. His voice was eerily calm. Did you ever plan on telling me? Marissa shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. I never wanted to hurt you. Greg let out a hollow laugh. You never wanted to hurt me? He grabbed the test results and held them up. Then why the hell do I have this? She looked at the paper, her lips parting slightly as realization dawned. Greg's voice was low, but his fury burned beneath it. Do you know how I found out? Not because you had the decency to confess. Not because I caught you sneaking out of her bed. I found out because I got an STD, Marissa. He threw the paper at her feet. A disease that I could have passed on to you, that could have affected both of us. But I guess you already knew about that, didn't you? Tears streamed down her face now. I swear, I didn't know, Greg. Stop lying. He stood up, towering over her now. You think I don't know where you've been? You think I don't know about the bank account, about all the business trips you were taking? Jake Reynolds. He spat the name like venom. That's who you threw away our marriage for? Marissa's sobs grew louder. It wasn't just like that. I was unhappy, Greg. Greg clenched his jaw. So, your answer was to screw another man for 2 years? That's how you deal with unhappiness. She covered her face with her hands, shaking her head. I made a mistake. Greg laughed bitterly. No, a mistake is forgetting an anniversary. A mistake is saying something you don't mean in an argument. This was a choice. Over and over again for 2 years. Marissa looked up at him, her expression shifting. What do you want me to say? That I regret it? That I hate myself? Her voice took on an edge of defiance. Because I do, Greg. I regret it every day. Greg's gaze bore into her. Not enough to stop. Silence. Marissa wiped her face, her shoulders shaking. She looked so small now, but Greg refused to feel sorry for her. I need you to get tested, he said coldly. I don't know if you have it too, but you damn well better find out. She nodded numbly. And then you're going to pack your things. His voice hardened. Because you're leaving. Marissa's face crumpled. Greg, please. No, he stepped back. We're done. She let out a choked sob. What about the girls? Greg exhaled sharply, his hands balling into fists. They're staying with me. Her lips parted as if to argue, but then she saw it in his face. The finality, the absolute certainty. There was no fight left to be had. She nodded slowly, the weight of her actions finally crashing down on her. Okay. Greg watched as she turned toward the bedroom, disappearing inside to pack. The woman he had built a life with, the woman he had trusted with everything, was now just a stranger he used to love. The clock on the wall kept ticking, but Greg no longer heard it. His house was silent now. But for the first time in a long time, it was peaceful. The finality of the divorce didn't hit Greg all at once. It seeped in slowly, like water through cracked pavement. The papers were signed, the settlement finalized, and Marissa was gone. Physically, legally, emotionally. But the echoes of betrayal still lingered in the quiet moments. His daughters, Lisa and Ginger, had adjusted faster than he expected. Maybe they had seen it coming long before he did. Maybe kids always sense the fractures before they fully split apart. Now, on a crisp Saturday afternoon, Greg sat at the kitchen table with them, textbooks and notebooks spread across the wooden surface. Ginger, his youngest, tapped her pencil against her temple, deep in thought over a math problem. Lisa, more focused, scrawled answers with swift confidence. "All right," Greg said, glancing at Ginger's worksheet. "Let's look at this one again. What's the equation telling us?" Ginger groaned. "That math is stupid." Lisa snorted. "She's been saying that since third grade." Greg chuckled, shaking his head. "I think math's just being honest with you. It doesn't lie. Numbers are numbers. Facts are facts." Lisa looked up at him then, her hazel eyes so much like his own. "Kind of like people, huh?" Greg met her gaze, something deep twisting in his chest. There was no bitterness in her voice, no anger, just understanding. "Yeah," he admitted, "kind of like people." For the first time in months, the house didn't feel suffocating. It felt lighter. There were no late-night whispers behind closed doors. No scent of unfamiliar cologne clinging to Marissa's clothes. No forced smiles over dinner. Just the three of them. That evening, as Greg washed the dinner dishes, his phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Gina, his attorney. "Jake Reynolds just resigned. Thought you'd like to know." Greg wiped his hands on a dish towel and smirked. Marissa's former boss, the man she had risked everything for, had finally lost something himself. His reputation couldn't survive the scandal, the whispers, the scrutiny. Greg replied with a simple, karma. He didn't care about Jake anymore. He didn't even care about Marissa. That chapter was over. Later that night, he stepped onto the back porch with a beer in hand. The sky stretched endlessly above him, the stars sharp and bright in the cold night air. For so long, he had felt trapped in his own life, like a man sleepwalking through a marriage that had already ended long before he realized it. But now there was space. Space to breathe. Space to heal. A gentle creak came from the doorway behind him. He turned to see Lisa standing there, wrapped in a hoodie, her breath visible in the night air. "Can't sleep?" Greg asked. She shook her head and stepped outside, standing next to him. "Just thinking." Greg took a sip of his beer, letting the silence settle between them. "You know," Lisa said softly, "I used to think Mom was this perfect person. Like, she could do no wrong." She allowed a quiet laugh. "But she's just human, and humans mess up." Greg exhaled, nodding. "Yeah, they do." Lisa leaned her head against his shoulder, something she hadn't done since she was little. "I'm glad we have you." Greg swallowed past the lump in his throat. He draped an arm around her, holding her close. "You'll always have me," he promised. And for the first time in a long, long time, Greg Watson knew he wasn't broken anymore. He was whole. He was free. And the future? It was his. "She left me for a millionaire. Now she's begging to come back." The open road stretched before me like an unwritten chapter, a winding path carved between towering mountains, vast deserts, and sleepy small towns that held secrets in their quiet streets. My motorhome hummed beneath me, the dashboard glowing faintly in the early morning light as I pulled onto the highway, leaving the past behind me in the rearview mirror. This wasn't just a road trip. It was a declaration, a refusal to be weighed down by betrayal, bitterness, or the ghosts of what could have been. I had spent years building a life that I thought was unshakable, only to watch it crumble overnight. But what I learned, somewhere between heartbreak and healing, was that destruction isn't the end. Sometimes it's the beginning. The first stop was a small town just outside of Phoenix, Arizona. I parked near a roadside diner, the kind with flickering neon signs and a single waitress who looked like she had stories to tell. Over a plate of eggs and black coffee, I struck up a conversation with an old rancher named Gus. Weathered, slow-spoken, and wise in that way only men who've seen too much tend to be. Gus reminded me of something I had almost forgotten. "Life don't owe you nothing, son," he said, stirring sugar into his coffee with a steady hand. "It don't matter how hard you worked, how faithful you were, or how good you had it. Sometimes it just flips you on your ass for no damn reason." I smirked. "So what do you do when that happens?" He leaned back, creaking the old booth. "You get up, you move on, and you find something better." Maybe it was the simplicity of it, or maybe it was just the kind of truth I needed to hear, but it stayed with me as I left Arizona behind and drove toward the California coastline. I hadn't been back to my childhood home in years. The town was different now, gentrified in places, run down in others. But the baseball field, it was still there, exactly as I remembered it. Parking the motorhome, I stepped onto the field, the crunch of dirt beneath my boots stirring up memories. This was where it all started. Before the degrees, the career, the marriage. Before betrayal and heartbreak and reinvention. This was where I had first learned what it felt like to swing for something bigger than myself. The metal bleachers stood empty, their paint chipping. The old scoreboard was frozen at 0, long out of commission. And yet, standing there, I could still hear the echoes of the past, the crack of a bat, the cheers from my father in the stands, the quiet promise of a future that, back then, seemed so limitless. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of cut grass and warm earth. Then I smiled. I wasn't the same man who had stepped onto this field decades ago, full of dreams and blind optimism. I was something better. I was a man who had lost everything and rebuilt. A man who had learned that happiness wasn't about what you had, but what you chose to chase after. And I had a hell of a lot left to chase. Pulling my phone from my pocket, I dialed Tori. She picked up after 2 rings, her voice bright and familiar. "Dad, where are you?" "Standing on my old baseball field, thinking about life." She laughed. "You getting philosophical on me?" "Something like that." I could hear the smile in her voice. "Well, don't overthink it. Just keep driving. We'll see you when you get here." And that was it. That was all I needed. I walked back to the motorhome, turned the key in the ignition, and pulled back onto the highway. No destination, no agenda, just the road ahead, waiting to be written. And for the first time in a long time, I couldn't wait to see where it would take me. The days after Tessa's betrayal felt like moving through a thick fog, one that dulled my senses but sharpened my pain. The house, once filled with warmth, now echoed with a hollow silence. Tessa was gone, but her absence was a presence in itself, a specter that lurked in every room. I barely slept that first night. I sat in the living room, staring at the wedding photo still perched on the fireplace mantel. Tessa's smile in the picture, once genuine, now looked like a cruel joke. Had she already been lying back then, or had she changed somewhere along the way? I wasn't sure which answer was worse. At sunrise, Tori walked in, dressed in her usual no-nonsense fashion, jeans, a fitted blazer, and her signature fierce expression. She took one look at me, disheveled and exhausted, and sighed. "All right, Dad, here's what we're going to do." She tossed her laptop onto the coffee table and opened it. "Mom just thinks she can waltz out of here, take whatever she wants, and move on? Hell no, we're fighting back." I looked at her, surprised. "Tori," she held up a hand. "No, don't give me that. I don't want to fight crap. Mom isn't just leaving. She's stealing from you. From us." That got my attention. "Stealing?" Tori turned the screen toward me. It was our bank records, joint accounts, credit cards, everything. Numbers, dates, withdrawals. "She's been siphoning money out for months, Dad. Thousands. Before she even left. She's been planning this." I felt my pulse hammer against my skull. Tessa hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. She had been plotting a full-scale escape, ensuring she had a financial safety net before she even dropped the bomb. "You need a lawyer," Tori said. "Now." She had already done the research. Within an hour, I found myself sitting in a sleek downtown office, across from a woman who looked like she chewed through men like Charles for breakfast. Amanda Sloan, divorce attorney, shark, and, according to Tori, our best shot at getting justice. Amanda flipped through the documents, nodding as she skimmed. Finally, she leaned back, tapping a red pen against the folder. She's good, Amanda said, but not that good. Freezing the accounts today will stop any more damage. As for what's already gone, we'll make her pay it back. Something in me stirred, an ember of rage that had been smothered under the weight of shock. I want everything I'm entitled to, I said, my voice steel. Amanda's lips curled into a smirk. Now we're talking. That evening, Tia came home from campus, her face expectant. When she saw my expression, her eyes darkened. "It's bad, isn't it?" she asked quietly. I hesitated. "Your mother, she's been planning this for a while, and she's taken a lot of money." Tia was softer than her sister, more emotional, more willing to see the good in people. But at that moment, the warmth in her face vanished. So it wasn't just about Charles. She wanted out completely. I nodded. She swallowed hard, then did something I hadn't expected. She walked over and wrapped her arms around me, squeezing tight. "I hate her," she whispered against my shoulder. I didn't tell her not to. The next day, Amanda got to work. The accounts were frozen, the legal papers were filed, and the battle lines were drawn. Tessa must have gotten the news quickly because she called that afternoon. "Dax, what the hell is wrong with you?" she snapped as soon as I picked up. I let out a dry laugh. "You want a list? Or just the highlights?" "You froze our accounts. I need that money." "Correction," I said, my voice deadly calm. "That was our money, and you lost the right to it the moment you started sneaking around behind my back." She sputtered. "You're being unreasonable. You're making this ugly for no reason." "I didn't want to fight, Dax." I gritted my teeth. "Then maybe you shouldn't have started a war." She hung up. Tori, who had been listening from the other side of the kitchen, smirked. "Damn, Dad, that was cold. I love it." Over the next few weeks, the divorce moved quickly. Tessa tried to fight for more, but Amanda tore through her arguments with ruthless precision. At one point, during a tense negotiation, Tessa turned to me, her voice dripping with bitterness. "I don't even recognize you anymore," she said. I met her gaze, unflinching. "That's funny. I was just about to say the same thing about you." In the end, she walked away with what was fair, but nothing more. The money she had taken had to be returned, and any dreams she had of an easy transition into her new life were shattered. Good. Because I wasn't about to let her win. Not after everything she had done. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something I hadn't in weeks. Power. The courtroom smelled like polished wood and worn-out hope. My lawyer, Amanda Sloan, a sharp and ruthless woman with a reputation for tearing apart opponents, sat beside me, flipping through pages of our case file. Across the aisle sat Tessa, looking poised, her hairstyle just right, her outfit deliberately chosen to make her seem like the wounded party. Beside her was her lawyer, some overpaid suit who probably didn't care about justice, just his billable hours. I clenched my fists under the table. I wasn't here to fight for her love, nor to plead my case as the wronged husband. I was here to protect what was left of my life. Tessa had already made her decision. Now, we were here to settle the consequences. The judge, an older woman with tired eyes, skimmed through the case file before addressing the room. "Let's keep this civil. Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter, your attorneys will present their final arguments before we proceed with the ruling." Amanda stood first, her voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, my client, Dr. Dak Carter, has dedicated decades of his life to his career and family. He built a home, provided for his wife, and supported their children's futures. Yet, despite his loyalty, Mrs. Carter chose infidelity. Not only that, she attempted to drain shared assets before legal proceedings could even begin. We request an equitable division of assets, with full transparency on the funds Mrs. Carter attempted to conceal." The judge nodded, her gaze shifting to Tessa's lawyer. He stood and adjusted his tie, his voice smooth like a politician's. Your Honor, my client acknowledges her mistakes. However, we must consider her contributions as a wife and mother. Mrs. Carter devoted years to supporting her husband's demanding career and raising their children. While she regrets how the marriage ended, she is entitled to her fair share of their assets. I nearly scoffed out loud. Regrets how the marriage ended. That was a nice way of saying she packed up, took the money, and left to play house with another man. Then came the worst part, the cross-examinations. Tessa took the stand first, her voice laced with just the right amount of sadness, her eyes glistening as if she had rehearsed every word in the mirror. I never meant to hurt Dax, she said, her voice quivering. I loved him, but over time we grew apart. I felt invisible, like I wasn't needed anymore. And then I met Charles. He made me feel seen. Amanda rose to her feet, her expression unreadable. Mrs. Carter, did Dr. Carter ever abuse you, neglect you, betray you in any way before your affair? Tessa hesitated. No, but did he provide for you financially? Yes. Did he support you emotionally? Tessa glanced toward her lawyer, looking for a lifeline. Sometimes, but he was always working. Amanda cut her off. So, to be clear, your husband was a loyal provider, a committed father, and a faithful spouse, yet you still chose to cheat and steal from him? Silence. The judge adjusted her glasses. Mrs. Carter, answer the question. Tessa swallowed hard. Yes. And just like that, the carefully curated narrative she had tried to spin fell apart. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. The assets were split, but not in the way Tessa had hoped. She was forced to return the money she had taken, and her alimony request was denied. As we walked out of the courthouse, Tessa caught up to me in the hallway, her voice softer now. Dax, can we at least be friends? I turned to her, studying the face I had once loved. There was a time when I would have done anything to fix things, to understand why she had chosen someone else. But that time had passed. Friends, I repeated, letting the word linger in the air. Then I shook my head. No, Tessa, we were never friends. We were husband and wife. And now, we're nothing. She flinched, as if finally understanding the weight of what she had lost. I walked away, feeling lighter than I had in months. Coming home that night was strange. The house felt too big, too quiet. Tessa's things were gone, but ghosts of her remained. The faint scent of her perfume on a pillow, a forgotten coffee mug in the cabinet. Torai and Tia came over later, bringing takeout in their sharp, unapologetic humor. So, she wanted to be friends, huh? Torai smirked as she handed me a beer. Yeah, I said, shaking my head. Tia snorted. The audacity. I chuckled, feeling something I hadn't in a long time. Peace. As we sat around the kitchen table, laughing and eating, I realized something. Tessa may have walked away, but the people who truly mattered had stayed. And that was enough. Life has a way of balancing the scales. Sometimes justice arrives in the form of a gavel striking down in a courtroom. Other times, it sneaks in through the back door, patient and quiet, letting karma do its work. It had been nearly a year since the divorce was finalized. By then, I had stopped checking up on Tessa. She was a closed chapter, a name I no longer spoke, a ghost in my past. My focus was on my daughters, my work, and the steady process of reclaiming the life that she had shattered. But karma was busy, and when it finally arrived at her doorstep, it didn't just knock. It kicked the damn thing down. It started as a whisper, a casual comment at the university from a colleague who had overheard something at a country club. Did you hear about Charles? Word is, his whole empire's crumbling. I didn't care. At least, that's what I told myself. But as the days passed, the whispers turned into full-blown conversations, then headlines. Real estate mogul Charles Monroe files for bankruptcy after market collapse. Tessa Monroe, formerly Tessa Carter, forced to sell mansion amid financial crisis. That last one made me pause. It was surreal, seeing her name in the news, attached to words like loss and desperation. She had walked away from our marriage chasing a dream, only to watch it turn to ash in her hands. I wasn't a saint. I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a sliver of satisfaction in seeing karma do its work. But what I didn't expect was the call. It came late one evening. I was at home, reviewing notes for an upcoming presentation, when my phone buzzed. The screen flashed a name I hadn't seen in months. Tessa. I stared at it. Let it ring. Let it ring again. Then at the last second, I answered. Dax. Her voice was small, fragile in a way I had never heard before. I need to talk to you. I leaned back in my chair, a smirk playing at the edges of my lips. Here it comes. I don't think we have anything left to say. She hesitated. Please. I sighed. Curiosity won. Fine. Tomorrow. Meet me at the Rusty Spoon. Noon. The next day, I arrived a few minutes early, ordering a black coffee and settling into a booth near the back of the small cafe. I hadn't seen Tessa since the divorce hearing, but when she walked through the door, I barely recognized her. The woman who had once dripped with confidence, always put together, always effortlessly elegant, was gone. She looked tired, not just physically, though the dark circles beneath her eyes told their own story. It was something deeper, something hollow in the way she moved, like she had been carrying a weight far too heavy for far too long. She slid into the booth across from me, folding her hands together. You look good, she said softly. Can't say the same for you. Her lips pressed together. I didn't know her kindness. I made a mistake, Dax. I leaned back, crossing my arms. Oh, which part? The cheating? The lying? Or the part where you walked out on your family? She flinched. Good. I thought I was making the right choice, she whispered. Charles. He wasn't who I thought he was. I let out a short, humorless laugh. No kidding. Guess the money ran out. She looked down, twisting the napkin in her hands. He lost everything, she admitted. Bad investments. The market turned on him. One day we were looking at yachts in Miami. The next, we were selling furniture to pay off debts. I shook my head. And now you're here. Looking for what exactly? She met my eyes, and for a second, I saw the woman I had married. The one who, once upon a time, I had trusted with my entire heart. But I wasn't that man anymore, and she wasn't that woman. I want to come home. I blinked. Then I laughed. A real, full-bodied laugh that made a couple of patrons glance over. Home? You destroyed that. Home doesn't exist for you anymore. She reached across the table, desperation creeping into her voice. Dax, I was stupid. I see that now. I pull back. Don't sit here and pretend you just made a mistake. You didn't trip and fall into another man's arms. Tessa, you chose this. You chose him. And now that it's falling apart, you think you can waltz back into my life? Her eyes welled up with tears, but I felt nothing. I miss the girls, she whispered. I miss you. I studied her for a long moment before responding. The girls? The ones you abandoned? The ones who begged you not to leave? Yeah, they're doing just fine. Without you. She shook her head. I just want to be part of their lives again. Then you better start praying they'll forgive you. Because I sure as hell don't. I stood, tossing a few bills onto the table. Good luck, Tessa. You're going to need it. And with that, I walked out. I didn't look back. The first morning, I woke up alone after the divorce. I stared at the ceiling for an hour, listening to the silence. No Tessa moving around the kitchen. No coffee brewing. Just quiet. It was a strange, hollow feeling like stepping off a moving treadmill and feeling the ground stand still beneath you. For the first time in over 2 decades, I was no longer a husband, just a man. I won the legal battle, but that didn't mean I felt like a winner. The scars were still fresh, and even though Tessa was out of my life, her betrayal still lingered in the corners of my mind. I buried myself in work, extra projects, late nights in the lab, research papers that no one but my colleagues would read. My office became a refuge, a place where numbers and formulas made sense, unlike the chaos that had been my marriage. But as the months passed, something inside me shifted. I was tired of feeling like a ghost in my own life. One evening, Tori showed up at my house unannounced. She took one look at the half-empty whiskey glass on the coffee table and the unopened mail stacked on the counter and sighed. "Dad, this isn't you." I didn't argue because I knew she was right. Then she said something that stuck with me. "You're free now. Do something with it." That night, I sat down with a notepad and started making a list. It was a simple list at first. Places I had always wanted to go, things I had always wanted to do, but never could because of work, marriage, responsibilities. I had spent my entire adult life playing it safe, always thinking about the next step, the next goal. But for what? For someone who had walked away the second she found something more exciting? Not anymore. The first thing on the list was something that had always been in the back of my mind: a solo trip. Not a quick business trip or a weekend getaway, but something real. 2 weeks later, I was on a plane to the Caribbean. The consulting gig had come up at the perfect time. An engineering firm in St. Lucia needed an expert to help optimize their manufacturing systems. Normally, I would have sent a colleague, but this time I said yes. The moment I stepped off the plane, the warm island air wrapped around me like a long-lost friend. The colors were brighter here. The ocean a shade of blue I didn't know existed, the trees a deep, vibrant green. And the people? They moved slower, laughed easier. No one was in a rush. I checked into a beachfront villa the company had arranged, but within days, I found myself spending more time at a small, family-run and down the road. The owner, a woman named Camille, ran the place with an easy charm. She had a smile that could disarm a soldier and an attitude that reminded me of a younger version of myself, fearless, unbothered by rules. One night, after a long day of work, I wandered into the inn's bar. Camille was behind the counter, slicing limes. "You look like a man who needs a drink." I chuckled. "That obvious?" She poured me a glass of aged rum, sliding it across the bar. "You're American. You work too much. You think too much. You need to stop." I raised an eyebrow. "And do what instead?" She grinned. "Live." It was such a simple word, but it hit me like a hammer. I started spending my evenings at the inn, listening to locals play music, drinking rum, and learning about the island. One night, Camille convinced me to go night swimming. "The water's warm," she promised. "You'll never feel more alive." Standing in the ocean under a full moon, feeling the waves lap against my skin, I realized something. I'd spent my whole life chasing security, stability, but real happiness? It was in moments like this, unplanned, unpredictable, and completely out of my control. I started saying yes more. Yes to a fishing trip with a group of retired sailors who had more stories than fish. Yes to hiking up a volcanic mountain at sunrise, where the view was so breathtaking it made my chest ache. Yes to a woman whose name I won't mention, but whose touch reminded me that I was still a man, still capable of passion. By the time my consulting contract ended, I had changed. Not in a dramatic, movie-worthy way. There was no grand epiphany, no perfect resolution. But I had let go of something heavy. I no longer felt like a man defined by what I had lost. I was just me. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. When I returned to Texas, my daughters immediately noticed the difference. "You look younger," Tia said, studying me over dinner. Poor I smirked. Or maybe he just got a tan and finally started using moisturizer. I laughed, shaking my head. They had no idea how right they were. I didn't move back into my old life. That house, the one Tessa and I had built together, no longer felt like home. So I sold it, bought a smaller place, one that was just mine. I kept traveling, sometimes for work, sometimes just for the hell of it. And women? I wasn't in a rush. I had flings, sure, but I was in no hurry to settle down again. I liked the freedom, the unpredictability. Tessa, meanwhile, was drowning. After Charles went broke, she tried reaching out, first to the girls, then to me. She wanted to meet for coffee to talk. I ignored her. The past was a place I had no interest in revisiting. One evening, as I sat on my back porch with a glass of bourbon, watching the Texas sunset, I thought about how much had changed, how much I had changed. I wasn't the same man who had been blindsided by his wife's betrayal. I was someone new, and for the first time in years, I was excited to see where the road would take me next. It was a crisp May evening, the kind where the air carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and distant barbecue smoke. The university courtyard buzzed with the energy of families celebrating their graduates, but my focus was on one person, my youngest daughter, Tia. She stood on the stage, clad in her cap and gown, her dark curls peeking out beneath the mortarboard. When her name was called, a thunderous applause erupted from our section of the crowd. Tori, standing beside me, whistled loudly. I grinned, clapping hard enough that my palms stung. Tia had done it. Top of her class, a degree in civil engineering, and a bright future ahead. I should have been thinking about that, about how proud I was. But there was a shadow lingering at the edge of my thoughts, a ghost that refused to stay buried. Tessa. I hadn't seen her in nearly 2 years, and I preferred it that way. But I knew she was here. I could feel it. The ceremony ended, and the courtyard swarmed with families reuniting. I spotted Tia moving toward us, her gown flowing as she rushed forward. She threw her arms around me, squeezing tight. "We did it, Dad," she whispered. I hugged her back, my voice thick with emotion. "No, baby girl. You did it." Tori joined in, and for a moment, it was just us, the three of us like it had been for the past 2 years. We had weathered the storm, built something new from the ruins. But then, as if summoned by fate, the moment shattered. A familiar voice cut through the noise. "Tia." We turned. There she was. Tessa stood a few feet away, hesitant, her hands clutching a small gift bag. She looked older, not just in the way that time naturally wore a person down, but in the way regret and disappointment carved themselves into your features. Her once meticulously styled hair was now a shade too dark, as if she were trying to reclaim her youth. Her dress, though elegant, hung awkwardly on her frame, as if she had lost too much weight too quickly. She was nervous. That much was obvious. She didn't belong here, and she knew it. Tia stiffened beside me. Tori crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. I wanted to say congratulations," Tessa said, her voice softer than I remembered. She took a hesitant step forward, extending the small bag. "I got you something." Tia didn't reach for it. She just stared, her face a storm of emotions. "You don't have to do this, Mom." Tessa's face fell. "I want to. Please." Silence. Tori, never one to hold back, finally spoke. "Why are you really here?" Tessa flinched, as if she'd been slapped. I wanted to see my daughter graduate." Tori's laugh was sharp. "Now you care?" I could see Tessa struggling, grasping for some justification, some excuse that would make this moment easier. But there was nothing. No words could undo the years of abandonment. No apology could erase the fact that she had chosen someone else over us. Tia finally spoke, her voice steady. "Mom, I don't hate you, but you made your choices. You left. You weren't there for Dad when he needed you. You weren't there for me and Tori. We got through it without you." Tessa's eyes filled with tears. "I regret it, Tia. I regret everything." Tia shook her head. "That's not enough." Tessa's gaze flickered to me, searching for some kind of opening, some shred of hope that maybe, just maybe, I'd let her back in. But all I had for her was a quiet, impassive stare. Tessa looked down, nodding slowly, as if she finally understood. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For the first time, I believed her, but it didn't change anything. Tia finally took the bag, but didn't open it. "Goodbye, Mom." Tessa hesitated, then turned and walked away. As she disappeared into the crowd, Tori let out a deep breath, then turned to me. That was weirdly satisfying. I chuckled, wrapping an arm around each of my daughters. "Come on, let's go celebrate." And just like that, the past was left where it belonged, behind us. The open road stretched before me like an unwritten chapter, a winding path carved between towering mountains, vast deserts, and sleepy small towns that held secrets in their quiet streets. My motorhome hummed beneath me, the dashboard glowing faintly in the early morning light as I pulled onto the highway, leaving the past behind me in the rearview mirror. This wasn't just a road trip. It was a declaration, a refusal to be weighed down by betrayal, bitterness, or the ghosts of what could have been. I had spent years building a life that I thought was unshakable, only to watch it crumble overnight. But what I learned, somewhere between heartbreak and healing, was that destruction isn't the end. Sometimes it's the beginning. The first stop was a small town just outside of Phoenix, Arizona. I parked near a roadside diner, the kind with flickering neon signs and a single waitress who looked like she had stories to tell. Over a plate of eggs and black coffee, I struck up a conversation with an old rancher named Gus. Weathered, slow-spoken, and wise in that way only men who've seen too much tend to be, Gus reminded me of something I had almost forgotten. "Life don't owe you nothing, son," he said, stirring sugar into his coffee with a steady hand. "It don't matter how hard you worked, how faithful you were, or how good you had it. Sometimes it just flips you on your ass for no damn reason." I smirked. "So what do you do when that happens?" He leaned back, creaking the old booth. "You get up, you move on, and you find something better." Maybe it was the simplicity of it, or maybe it was just the kind of truth I needed to hear, but it stayed with me as I left Arizona behind and drove toward the California coastline. I hadn't been back to my childhood home in years. The town was different now, gentrified in places, run down in others. But the baseball field, it was still there, exactly as I remembered it. Parking the motorhome, I stepped onto the field, the crunch of dirt beneath my boots stirring up memories. This was where it all started. Before the degrees, the career, the marriage. Before betrayal and heartbreak and reinvention. This was where I had first learned what it felt like to swing for something bigger than myself. The metal bleachers stood empty, their paint chipping. The old scoreboard was frozen at 0, long out of commission. And yet, standing there, I could still hear the echoes of the past, the crack of a bat, the cheers from my father in the stands, the quiet promise of a future that, back then, seemed so limitless. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of cut grass and warm earth. Then I smiled. I wasn't the same man who had stepped onto this field decades ago, full of dreams and blind optimism. I was something better. I was a man who had lost everything and rebuilt. A man who had learned that happiness wasn't about what you had, but what you chose to chase after. And I had a hell of a lot left to chase. Pulling my phone from my pocket, I dialed Tori. She picked up after 2 rings, her voice bright and familiar. "Dad, where are you?" "Standing on my old baseball field, thinking about life." She laughed. "You getting philosophical on me?" Something like that. I could hear the smile in her voice. "Well, don't overthink it. Just keep driving. We'll see you when you get here." And that was it. That was all I needed. I walked back to the motorhome, turned the key in the ignition, and pulled back onto the highway. No destination, no agenda, just the road ahead, waiting to be written. And for the first time in a long time, I couldn't wait to see where it would take me. Broken trust, new beginnings, a father's fight for justice. Marriage is supposed to be built on trust, but trust is a quiet thing. It doesn't announce itself, doesn't demand recognition. It simply exists until the moment it doesn't. I used to believe April and I had something unbreakable, a love that had weathered time, change, and hardship. I was wrong. It's strange how, in hindsight, you can pinpoint the exact moments when everything began to unravel. Not all at once. No, betrayal is more subtle than that. It starts as a whisper, a quiet shift in the wind, a look that lingers too long or doesn't linger long enough. You don't notice it at first. You convince yourself it's nothing. But then the signs pile up, each one a little harder to ignore. Looking back, I can see them now, clear as day. The late nights. The way she pulled away when I reached for her in bed. The smile she once reserved for me, now flashing too easily at her phone. The unexplained absences, always brushed off with a casual, "Oh, just a girl's night." And the worst part? I believed her. I wanted to believe her. Because the alternative, the thought that my wife, the mother of my children, the woman I built my life around, might be lying to me, that was unthinkable. April was beautiful in a way that never needed effort. She had that effortless charm, the kind that made people want to be around her to earn her attention. When we first met, it had been intoxicating. She had this easy laugh, this mischievous glint in her, like she knew something the rest of the world didn't. I fell for her fast, hard, and for a while it was perfect. We built a life together, a home. We had two boys, Nathan and Jacob. They became my world, the axis my life revolved around. I worked harder, put in the hours, made sure they never wanted for anything. I thought I was being a good husband, a good father, but I was blind. The distance between us crept in like a slow-moving tide, barely noticeable at first, but relentless. By the time I truly saw it, I was already drowning. I remember the night I first allowed doubt to settle in my chest like a living thing. It was late, close to midnight, and April still wasn't home. She had said she was going out for dinner with Robin, our neighbor, but dinner didn't take 6 hours. I sat in the dim light of our living room, the TV on, but ignored my phone in my hand. I had already texted her twice. No response. I could have called. I should have called. But something inside me hesitated. Some quiet, gnawing voice whispered, "What if she doesn't answer? What if she does? What if you don't like what you hear at her voice?" When she finally walked through the door, she didn't look guilty. She looked radiant. Her hair was slightly tousled, her cheeks flushed, her lips parted like she had been laughing just moments before. She froze when she saw me, then forced a smile. "You're still up?" she asked, dropping her purse onto the counter. "Yeah," I said, studying her. She ran a hand through her hair, shaking it out, exhaling like she had just had the best night of her life. Then, as if realizing something, she turned to me with a look of practiced concern. "Is everything okay?" I wanted to ask her. I wanted to demand the truth, to tell her that something felt wrong, that I could feel the weight of a secret pressing between us. But I didn't. Instead, I just nodded. "Yeah, just couldn't sleep." She hesitated for half a second, then shrugged, walking past me toward the bedroom. "I'm exhausted," she murmured, stretching. "We had such a great time. Robin was hilarious tonight." I watched her disappear down the hall, my stomach twisting. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But trust is a quiet thing. And mine had just stopped whispering. Pain throbbed behind my eyes, a relentless drumbeat pounding against my skull. My head felt like it was stuffed with cotton, my limbs heavy as lead. I barely remembered getting home. Only that Penny, our office secretary, had driven me after I nearly passed out at my desk. I'd stumbled through the front door, collapsed onto the couch, and surrendered to sleep before my body hit the cushions. I must have slept for hours. But it wasn't the pain that woke me. It was the voices. Familiar. Low. Dripping with something that made the fine hairs on my arms stand on end. I stayed still, blinking sluggishly at the ceiling, disoriented. The light filtering through the blinds had shifted. It was later now, maybe evening. My mind, still sluggish from sleep, struggled to piece together why the voices downstairs felt off. Then I recognized one of them. April. My wife. Her tone was light, teasing. There was laughter woven into it, the kind she used to have when we first started dating. But there was something else there too. A softness. A warmth. The kind of warmth she hadn't used with me in years. And then, "Come on, April, how was it? Was it as good as before?" The second voice sent a chill down my spine. Robin. Our next-door neighbor. I felt a slow, crawling sense of unease settle in my gut, spreading like ice through my veins. The way she asked the question, like a friend eager for juicy details, I didn't want to understand what she meant. I refused to understand. But April's answer shattered my denial in an instant. Better. A rustle. Maybe Robin shifting in her seat, leaning closer. This time, it was incredible. Mind-blowing. The best sex I've ever had. The world tilted. The room felt too small, the air too thick. I tried to breathe, but each inhale felt like sucking in glass. Robin giggled. Better than with Chris? I held my breath. A small, pathetic part of me needed April to say no, to laugh it off, to say that no one could ever compare to her husband. But her voice came smooth and effortless, and it cut through me like a knife. Hell yes, I love Chris to death, but he's never made me feel like that. Never. And I'd never let him do the things Carl does. He'd think I was some kind of strumpet if I did. Carl. A name I had never even considered. A man I had never suspected. And love? She loved me? Was that supposed to make this easier? As if her affection excused her betrayal? Robin's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. So, does Carl think you're a strumpet? April laughed. Soft. Almost dreamy. Of course. But I'm his strumpet, and I like it. God, I can't wait for next time. Something inside me twisted, sharp, ugly. My stomach churned, my migraine forgotten, replaced by a different kind of pain. Not the dull ache of exhaustion. Not the searing heat of rage. But something colder, something deeper. Robin's voice sobered slightly. Aren't you scared Chris will find out? What would he do? A pause. A hesitation so slight I almost missed it. Then, April's answer. He won't. And even if he did, so what? He'd never leave me. He's too nice, too devoted. He'd forgive me. He loves the kids too much to risk losing them. With the right lawyer, I'd destroy him. I felt my hands curl into fists, my nails digging into my palms, so hard it hurt. She had already planned for my discovery. Already decided my response. Already dismissed me as weak. I closed my eyes, swallowing down the bitter taste in my mouth. She thought I would stay. She thought I would beg. She thought she knew me. She was wrong. So very, very wrong. Silence hung thick in the air, pressing against my ears, my chest, my skull. April and Robin stood frozen in the kitchen, their faces pale under the dim light of the pendant lamp. The wine glasses on the counter, still half full, reflected a distorted version of the moment. A moment that would split my life into before and after. Robin looked like a deer caught in headlights, shifting nervously from foot to foot, fingers twitching at the hem of her blouse. But April's expression was different. Her lips parted, then closed, as if weighing her words. No guilt, no remorse, just calculation. I felt a strange, detached calm settle over me, like I wasn't standing in my own kitchen, listening to my wife confess to another woman that another man had been inside her, that she had planned for this moment, had already mapped out how I would react, how she would win. I exhaled slowly through my nose, steadying the tremor in my hands. Where are the boys? My voice was steady, controlled. April blinked. If my response surprised her, she hid it well. With Pete and Robin's daughter, she answered smoothly. What does that have to do with anything? I ignored her question and turned to Robin instead. Did they hear any of that? Any of what you just said? She swallowed hard. And no, they're my place. They didn't hear anything. For a moment, I studied her. This woman who had sat at our dinner table, shared drinks with us on the patio, laughed with my wife about things I would never understand. And yet, she had known. Robin had known. And she had done nothing. Her mouth opened, but whatever she was about to say died in her throat. With a muttered, I should go, she grabbed her purse and practically ran out the door, leaving me alone with April. My wife. My betrayer. She let out a slow, deliberate sigh and folded her arms, watching me like she was studying a chessboard. How much did you hear? My fingers curled into fists at my sides. Enough. She tilted her head, her mouth pressing into a thin line. Chris. Who is he? I cut her off, my voice dangerously low. Who the hell is Carl? A flicker of something, annoyance, crossed her face before she schooled her features into something more neutral. It doesn't matter. I took a step closer. The hell it doesn't. Her jaw tightened. Look, I'm not doing this with you. Not when you're like this. Like what? My voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent beneath it, a storm brewing in my gut. Like this, she gestured vaguely toward me. Like you're about to lose it. And for what, Chris? A mistake. A mistake. I let out a breath of hollow laughter, shaking my head. A mistake is forgetting to turn off the coffee pot. A mistake is backing into a shopping cart in the parking lot. My eyes locked onto hers, unblinking. You don't trip and fall onto another man's dick by accident, April. Her expression darkened. Don't talk to me like that. Why not? Afraid of being disrespected, I took another step toward her. She didn't back away, but I could see it in the slight tensing of her shoulders. She wasn't as confident as she wanted to be. You sat here in my house, drinking my wine, talking to our neighbor about how much better another man makes you feel. You laughed at me, said you'd never let me do to you what he does because I'd think you were what was the word? A strumpet? She flinched, just barely. Did you ever stop to think about what that says about me? My voice was quieter now, lower. That maybe I never saw you that way because I loved you? Because I respected you? Because I believed you were someone worth protecting? April exhaled sharply, frustration flickering across her features. Chris, No. I held up a hand. Don't give me some half-assed excuse. Don't insult my intelligence. Just tell me the truth. How long? A beat of silence. Then, does it matter? I stared at her, something inside me breaking apart, shattering like glass on concrete. Jesus Christ. I let out a humorless chuckle, running a hand over my face. April shifted her weight, crossing her arms tighter. Chris, I never meant for you to find out like this. I let my hand drop. That's the problem, isn't it? You didn't mean for me to find out at all. Her lips pressed together. I took a slow, measured breath and turned away. I'm putting the boys to bed. My voice was eerily calm, even to my own ears. Chris, we need to talk about this. No. I turned back to face her, my expression unreadable. You need to talk. I need to think. And with that, I walked out, leaving her standing in the kitchen, the weight of what she had done settling into the silence. But in my mind, the decision was already made. This marriage was over. She just didn't know it yet. The house was silent. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind churning like a storm-tossed sea. April was asleep beside me, her breathing slow, even, peaceful. I envied her. She slept like a woman with nothing to lose, like someone who had already written the ending to our story and assumed she would be the one holding the pen. But she was wrong. I turned onto my side, watching her in the dim glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. This woman, this stranger in my bed, was not the woman I had loved. She was not the woman I had built a life with, sacrificed for, fought for. She was a liar, a betrayer, a woman who thought she could shatter my trust, desecrate our marriage, and still keep me tethered to her. She had already decided how I would react. He'd never leave me. The words echoed in my head like a curse. She believed I was weak, that I would swallow my pride, shove down my pain, and stay. She thought she knew me. I slid out of bed, carefully, moving slow, deliberate. My pulse thudded in my ears as I made my way to the closet, easing the door open without a sound. I reached for a duffel bag. Then I started packing. Clothes for me. Jeans, t-shirts, enough to last a few weeks. Socks, underwear, the jacket I always kept in the hall closet. Clothes for the boys. I picked the ones they liked best. Liam's Spider-Man pajamas, Ethan's favorite hoodie, the one with the little dinosaur spikes down the back. Shoes. Toothbrushes. They're stuffed animals. Every move I made was calculated, measured. I worked like a surgeon, precise and efficient. Next, the documents. I dug through the drawer in my office, my fingers closing around the manila folder where I kept the birth certificates, passports, social security cards. April had always teased me about being meticulous, about having everything too organized. Tonight, it worked in my favor. Then the laptop, my external hard drive, my phone charger. I grabbed the cash I kept hidden in the lockbox under the bed, a habit from my father, who had always told me, a man should have an escape fund, even if he never plans to run. For the first time, I was grateful I had listened. I moved like a shadow, every step careful, every breath controlled. April didn't stir. When I had everything packed, I stood in the doorway and looked at her one last time. I had spent years loving this woman. I had held her through sickness, through struggles, through the birth of our children. I had worked late nights, taken extra shifts, done everything I could to build a life she would never have to worry in. And in the end, she had given herself to another man and laughed about it. My hands curled into fists, but I didn't let the anger consume me. Not yet. I turned away, stepping into the hallway. Now, there was only one thing left to do. I took my tools from the garage. The deadbolt on the front door was the easiest, just a quick swap of the cylinder. The back door required more work, but nothing I hadn't done before. By the time I was finished, April was locked inside. I was locked out, and she wouldn't realize it until morning. I checked my watch. 4:27 a.m. The sun would rise soon. I went to my son's room, my heart tightening at the sight of them. Liam was sprawled across the mattress, his blankets kicked off, one arm draped over Ethan, who was curled into a ball, his face half buried in his pillow. They were safe, innocent, unaware of the storm that had shattered their home. I knelt beside them, brushing a stray curl from Ethan's forehead. "We're leaving, buddy," I whispered. He stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. "Where?" he mumbled sleepily. "Somewhere better." He yawned, trusting me completely, and nodded. 15 minutes later, I was pulling out of the driveway. I didn't look back. The night was thick with silence, the kind that wraps around you like a suffocating blanket. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the stillness of a moment stretched too thin, trembling on the edge of something irreversible. I sat in the dim glow of the kitchen light, a cup of untouched coffee cooling between my hands. The house felt different now. It had once been my sanctuary, the walls infused with years of laughter, whispered bedtime stories, and the quiet hum of a life I thought was unshakable. But tonight, it was a tomb, cold, empty, filled only with ghosts of what I used to believe. The suitcase sat by the door. Two smaller bags, one for each of my sons, rested beside it. Everything I needed was in those bags. Everything important, anyway. Clothes, documents, enough cash to keep us steady until I figured out the next step. I had been careful, precise. No wasted movement. No second-guessing. April was still asleep upstairs, oblivious. I wanted to hate her. I wanted to storm into our bedroom, shake her awake, demand answers, scream until my throat was raw. But what good would it do? What words could possibly bridge the chasm she had carved between us? She had made her choice. Now I was making mine. I rose from the chair, moving on instinct. My mind felt detached from my body, like I was watching myself from a distance. Just another man slipping away into the night. I crept down the hallway, pushing open the door to my son's bedroom. They were curled up in their beds, small and peaceful, lost in dreams untouched by betrayal. My heart clenched at the sight of them. They didn't know. Not yet. I crouched beside their beds, brushing the hair from my eldest's forehead. He stirred slightly, mumbling something incoherent before settling again. This wasn't fair to them. None of it was. But staying would be worse. I exhaled slowly, steadying myself. Then, with the gentleness of a thief, I scooped up my youngest first, wrapping him in his blanket before carrying him out to the car. The night air was cool against my skin as I buckled him into his seat, his little body sagging against the belt in deep sleep. One trip down, one more to go. I repeated the process with my eldest, moving quietly, efficiently. My heart hammered as I carried him through the house, every creak of the floorboards amplifying in my ears like the tolling of a bell. I half expected April to stir, to wake, to catch me in the act. But she didn't. She slept soundly in the bed we had once shared, unaware that by morning, her world would be different. By morning, I would be gone. I slipped into the driver's seat, my hands gripping the steering wheel, knuckles white. The car was already packed. Gas tank full. Routes planned. I had done my research, cities with good schools, places far enough from here that we could start fresh. I turned the key. The engine rumbled to life, breaking the silence like a crack of thunder. I stole one last glance at the house in the rearview mirror. The house where I had built a life, where I had loved a woman who never truly loved me back. Then I put my foot on the gas. And I never looked back. The first message came before I even reached the state border. April, Chris, where are you? I didn't answer. The phone buzzed again. April, the locks? What the hell is going on? I imagined her standing on the porch in her thin robe, rattling the locked door in frustration. Maybe she had tried using her key at first, thinking she was just groggy from sleep. But when it didn't work, when she realized what I had done, I could picture her panic setting in. She had never expected this. Another message. April, where are the boys? That one stung, but not in the way she probably intended. The boys. My boys. She hadn't given them a second thought while she was sneaking around, but now that the power was slipping from her grasp, she suddenly remembered she was their mother. Another buzz. April, you're overreacting. Let's talk about this. Overreacting. I nearly laughed. She thought I would play my part, didn't she? That I would do what every good husband did when faced with betrayal. Yell a little, sleep on the couch for a while, maybe even cry in the shower. But in the end, I would stay. Because that's what I had always done. Forgiven, excused, adapted. Not this time. I set the phone on the passenger seat and focused on the road. The sky was beginning to lighten, a deep purple giving way to the first streaks of orange. In the back seat, the boys were still asleep, their faces soft in the glow of the streetlights. They had no idea how much their world had changed overnight. I had done this for them, but I'd also done it for me. The phone rang. April. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, another message. April. Chris, answer me. We need to talk. Please. I could picture her now, pacing the living room, running a hand through her hair, her mind racing through damage control. She wasn't sorry. She was afraid. Not of losing me, but of losing control. Because, in her mind, she had already won. She had the perfect setup. A husband who worked himself to exhaustion, who took care of the kids, who came home every night without question. And in the shadows, she had Carl, the one who made her feel alive. She had built a world where she got everything she wanted. And I had just burned it to the ground. Another call. This time I answered. Where are you? She demanded before I could even speak. I kept my voice calm. On the road. Chris, this is insane. You can't just take the boys. They're my children, April, and I'm their father. She let out a breath, trying to regain her composure. I get that you're upset. Upset. I let out a humorless laugh. That's an understatement. A pause. Then a shift in her tone. Less frantic, more measured. Come home. Let's talk. No. Silence. Then her voice sharpened. This is kidnapping. There it was. The mask slipping. The real April. The one who had mapped out every scenario in her head. Realizing this was one she hadn't prepared for. This is me leaving, I corrected. And trust me, I've already spoken to a lawyer. You'd have to prove I'm a danger to them for this to count as kidnapping. And we both know I'm not. Her breath hitched. She knew I had her. For the first time in years, I had the upper hand. Her voice dropped, low and venomous. You're making a mistake. No, April. I exhaled, gripping the wheel tighter. The mistake was trusting you. And with that, I hung up. The road stretched ahead of me, empty and full of possibilities. I didn't know where it would lead, but I knew one thing for certain. I was never going back. The gavel struck wood. Custody of both children is awarded to Christopher Calloway. April gasped, her nails digging into the oak table before her. I could feel her eyes burning into me, but I didn't turn to look. I kept my gaze locked on the judge, on the words that seal my fate, the fate I had fought so damn hard for. For months, she had tried to paint me as the villain. She spun lies in court, claiming I was unstable, manipulative, even abusive. But the evidence told another story. A story of a mother who had abandoned her children in pursuit of pleasure. A story of a woman so convinced of her control over a man that she never once thought he would fight back. She never thought I had it in me. But I did. When the hearing ended, I stood, my lawyer shaking my hand with a firm nod. April didn't move. She sat there, stunned, blinking rapidly as if trying to wake herself from a nightmare. And then, under her breath, she whispered something. "You were supposed to forgive me." I did turn then, just enough to meet her eyes. "That's the problem," I said quietly. "You thought you could break me and I'd still love you." She flinched. I walked away. The boys and I moved states after that. Not out of fear, not out of spite, just out of necessity. I didn't want to raise them in the shadow of betrayal, in a town where every street corner whispered of memories I wanted to erase. So we started over. A quiet little town nestled by the coast, where the air smelled of salt and the mornings were painted in gold. I found a job at a small firm, nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave me time to be present. Truly present. Something I hadn't been in years. The boys adjusted faster than I expected. Kids are resilient like that. At first, they asked about their mother. I answered them honestly, but carefully. I never spoke ill of her. I wanted to be better than that. But I didn't lie for her either. Mom made choices that hurt our family. I told them one night, tucking them into their shared bed in our new home. I made a choice too, to protect us, to start fresh. "Do you still love her?" my eldest, Ryan, asked. I hesitated, staring at the ceiling for a moment. Then I exhaled. I love what I thought she was. But people change, and sometimes we have to let them go. He nodded, not fully understanding, but accepting. That was enough. It took a long time before I felt normal again. The scars April left weren't the kind you could see. They ran deep like roots twisting through my chest, squeezing tight whenever I thought about trust, about love, about letting someone in again. But healing comes in strange ways. Like the first time I laughed without forcing it. Like the day I realized I wasn't checking my phone, half expecting another manipulative message from April. Like the warm, simple joy of sitting on our back porch, watching the boys chase fireflies, their giggles echoing into the dusk. One night, as I stood in the doorway of their room, watching them sleep, I felt something unexpected. Peace. For so long, I had been drowning in anger, in resentment, in the need to prove something. But here, in this quiet, in this life, I built from the ashes of betrayal. I had nothing left to prove. I had won. Not just in court, not just in custody, but in reclaiming myself. I had been broken, but I wasn't broken anymore. I was free, betrayed, and broken, but I came back different. Charlie Wilson had always believed that love, real love, was built on trust. And for the first few years of his marriage, he had trusted Pam with everything. Their relationship had been the kind that made people envious. He was the dependable, hard-working accountant, and she was the lively, sharp-witted woman who could light up a room with her smile. But lately, something had shifted. It started with the little things. Pam would come home late from work at the supermarket, offering vague explanations about extra shifts or helping a coworker. She had always been affectionate, quick with a hug or a kiss, but now she pulled away when he reached for her. When they spoke, her responses were clipped, her laughter forced. At first, Charlie ignored it, telling himself that all couples went through phases. Maybe she was just stressed. Maybe she needed space. But then came the nights she didn't come home at all. She had an answer, of course. She always did. "Work emergency," she'd say, brushing past him on the way to the shower. Or, "I stayed at Claire's place. I was too exhausted to drive home." The excuses were paper thin, barely holding together under the weight of his growing suspicion. And the worst part? She had stopped looking at him the way she used to. There had been a time when her eyes would soften whenever she saw him, when she would curl up against him on the couch and whisper about their future, about vacations they would take, the house they would grow old in. But now, her gaze was different, colder, detached, like he was a stranger in his own home. Then, one evening, Charlie found something that shattered his last ounce of denial. He had gone to the garage to grab a wrench when he noticed her car trunk was slightly open. It wasn't like Pam to leave it that way. She was meticulous, almost obsessive about keeping her things in order. Something about it sent a chill down his spine. He lifted the trunk, and there, tucked in the corner, was an overnight bag. His heart thudded in his chest as he pulled it out. It wasn't the usual gym bag she took when visiting her sister. This one was packed with clothes he had never seen her wear: tight skirts, lacy lingerie, heels far higher than anything practical. A travel-sized bottle of perfume rested on top, along with a box of condoms. They hadn't used condoms in years. For a long moment, Charlie just stood there, gripping the bag so tightly his knuckles went white. This was it, the proof. A dull roar filled his ears as he placed everything back exactly as he had found it, careful not to disturb a single item. His mind raced, a storm of anger, heartbreak, and disbelief. He could confront her, demand answers, yell, scream, ask why. But deep down, he already knew what she would do. She would lie. She would twist the truth until he was the bad guy for doubting her. And even if she admitted it, even if she confessed, what then? Would she beg for forgiveness? Would she tell him it was just a mistake, that it didn't mean anything? Charlie exhaled slowly, his breath shaky. No, he wouldn't give her the satisfaction. He was going to find out the truth for himself. And when he did, Pam wouldn't be able to talk her way out of it. Charlie sat in his car, fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His heart pounded in his chest like a drum of war, each beat a warning, a harbinger of something he wasn't ready to face. Pam had just left work, but she wasn't coming home. She had her overnight bag slung over her shoulder, the same one she used for weekend getaways. But she wasn't heading to a hotel, not unless that hotel was on the other side of town, in the worst part of it. He followed at a distance, careful not to get too close. His silver sedan was unremarkable, blending into the city streets, but his presence here was unnatural. He wasn't a spy, a detective, or a man prone to paranoia. He was just Charlie, an accountant, a husband, a fool who had trusted too much. Pam stopped at a gas station on the outskirts of town. Charlie pulled into a spot by the air pump and watched from his rearview mirror. She stepped out of the car and, right before his eyes, transformed into someone else. Gone was the conservative work attire. She popped open the trunk and pulled out something else entirely, something meant for a different kind of evening. A black microskirt that barely covered her, a sheer blouse that left nothing to the imagination. As she checked her reflection in the car window, she tied her hair up high, exposing her neck in a way that made Charlie's stomach turn. This wasn't his wife. This was someone else entirely. A stranger. She hopped back in her car, her lips curling into a satisfied smirk. Then she peeled out of the lot, tires screeching against the pavement. Charlie hesitated for only a moment before following. The drive led him deeper into a part of town he had no business being in. Streetlights flickered like dying fireflies, casting jagged shadows over cracked pavement. Graffiti covered the walls of abandoned buildings, and figures lingered in alleyways, watching cars pass like predators picking their prey. Charlie's gut twisted. Pam pulled into a bar parking lot and slid into a space near the entrance. The place was infamous, the kind of bar people whispered about but never visited unless they belonged there. The Pit. That was its name, and it fit. It was a haven for bikers, ex-cons, drug dealers, and lost souls looking for destruction. Charlie had seen enough. He should have turned around, should have driven home, packed his bags, and walked away from the wreckage of his marriage before it swallowed him whole. But something inside him needed proof. Real proof. So he parked across the street, shut off his lights, and stepped out. Inside, the pit was a world of its own. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, the scent of sweat, leather, and spilled liquor clinging to everything. Music blared from the jukebox, a classic rock song with a deep bass that rattled the walls. The patrons were rough, all muscle and tattoos, their laughter guttural and mean. Charlie kept his head down, moving to the bar. He ordered a beer he had no intention of drinking and turned his attention to the mirror behind the counter. And there she was, Pam, sitting on the lap of a man who looked like he had been carved out of stone and violence. A massive figure, thick arms covered in ink, a beard that stretched his chest. He leaned in, whispering something in her ear, and she laughed, head thrown back, eyes half-lidded with something Charlie had not seen in years. Desire. Not the forced affection she gave him at home. This was real. His stomach churned. His throat tightened. She ran her hands down the biker's chest, fingers tracing the lines of his tattoos. Then she kissed him, deep and slow, as if savoring him. Charlie couldn't move, couldn't breathe. This was more than betrayal. This was obliteration. She pulled away just slightly, smiling against the man's lips, and turned her head lazily, casually. And then her gaze locked onto Charlie's reflection in the mirror. For a brief second, her eyes widened. Shock, caught, exposed. But it lasted only a moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, a smirk curled at her lips. She leaned in closer to the biker, her tongue flicking against his earlobe as she whispered something. Then she turned, and in a voice loud enough to slice through the music, she called out, "That's my husband, Charlie. Stop him. He's going to ruin this for all of us." The bar fell silent. Dozens of heads turned. The biker's grip on her waist tightened as he looked up, his dark eyes locking onto Charlie's with a mix of amusement and challenge. Charlie barely had time to react before a massive hand clamped down on his shoulder, spinning him around. The first punch landed hard. Then the second. Then the world exploded into pain. And all he heard before the darkness took him was Pam's laughter ringing in his ears. Charlie's pulse thundered in his ears as the room closed in around him. The dim bar, thick with the stench of stale beer and sweat, felt smaller by the second. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the blaring rock music, it all faded into a distant hum as his eyes locked onto Pam. She was draped over the lap of the man they called Behemoth, her fingers grazing his thick beard, her lips curled in amusement. His gut churned with sickness, not just from the betrayal, but from the way she reveled in it. And then she spoke. "That's my husband, Charlie. Stop him. He's going to ruin this for all of us." The moment her words hit the air, the atmosphere changed. The low murmur of conversation stopped. Heads turned. Eyes burned into him. Some curious, some amused, but most filled with the gleeful anticipation of a hunt. Charlie's survival instinct kicked in. He spun on his heel, heading for the door. "Get out now. Get out before." A rough hand clamped down on his shoulder, jerking him backward. "Not so fast, sweetheart," a voice growled. Charlie reacted instantly, twisting free and delivering a sharp elbow to the man's ribs. The biker grunted, doubling over, but Charlie barely had time to take a step before another man stepped into his path. This one was faster. A fist drove into Charlie's gut, stealing the air from his lungs. He staggered, the room tilting as pain radiated outward. Before he could recover, another blow caught him in the jaw, snapping his head to the side. The taste of copper flooded his mouth. The bar erupted into chaos. Boots thundered against the wooden floor as bodies pressed in, eager for blood sport. Charlie lashed out blindly, landing a punch on someone's cheekbone, feeling the dull crunch of impact. But it didn't matter. There were too many of them. A heavy forearm smashed into his back, sending him to his knees. A boot met his ribs, then another. A savage kick to his side stole what little breath he had left. Pain became his world. Through the onslaught, he heard Pam laughing, an easy, careless sound. It was cruel, familiar. He had heard it before, but never directed at him. Never like this. A monstrous shadow loomed over him, blocking out the dim bar lights. Behemoth. Charlie barely had time to raise his head before the man's tree-trunk fist crashed into his face. He went down hard, stars bursting behind his eyelids. Laughter rippled through the crowd, mingling with the sound of clinking glasses. To them, this was entertainment. Behemoth crouched beside him, pressing one meaty hand to Charlie's chest, pinning him down with ease. He leaned in close, his whiskey-soaked breath hot against Charlie's skin. "You thought she was yours, huh?" he rumbled. Charlie tried to speak, but blood filled his throat. He coughed, sputtering. Behemoth grinned. "She's mine now. Always has been. I've had her in every way a man can have a woman. Hell, every guy in here has had a turn." He laughed, slow and deliberate. Charlie's vision blurred. His body screamed in agony. And still Pam laughed. That sound, that betrayal, that was what hurt the most. Behemoth's grip tightened around Charlie's throat. "You're nothing," he sneered. "A punching bag, a joke. And when I'm done, you'll crawl out of here like the pathetic little bitch you are." Charlie wanted to fight, wanted to break free, but his strength was gone. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was Pam's smirk, cruel, victorious. Then, everything faded to black. Pain was a living thing inside Charlie's body, crawling through his ribs like fire, coiling around his limbs like lead. Every breath sent a shockwave of agony through his chest, but he forced himself to stay conscious. He was lying on the cold, filthy concrete of the bar's back lot, hidden in the shadows, dumped like garbage. The air stank of spilled beer, cigarette butts, and old motor oil. Somewhere close, a dog barked. A radio inside the bar played some old rock song, half drowned by the drunken voices of the men who had beaten him senseless. Charlie could hear them laughing. Pam's voice rang out among them, sharp and cruel. "You really messed him up, babe." Babe. That word sliced deeper than any punch. She had said it with affection, adoration, and not to him. Charlie's fingers twitched against the gravel. Blood caked one eye shut, his lips swollen and split. He could taste iron in his mouth. But he wasn't dead. And as long as he wasn't dead, he could still get even. Slowly, he tested his limbs. Pain flared in every nerve, but nothing felt broken beyond repair. He turned his head, scanning the lot. His truck was parked in the far corner, maybe 20 yards away. Between him and salvation stood Pam's sleek, silver sedan and a row of expensive motorcycles, the kind these guys treated better than their own women. No one was looking his way. With a quiet grunt, Charlie rolled onto his stomach. The ground was cold against his bruised ribs. He gritted his teeth, dragging himself forward inch by inch. Every movement was agony. Every movement was necessary. The bikers were too distracted by their own arrogance to notice. Behemoth, the bastard who had beaten him worst, was boasting about how he had put Charlie in his place. Charlie grinned through his pain. "We'll see about that, asshole." Using Pam's car for support, he pulled himself to his feet. His vision swam, but he stayed upright. His truck was so close now, the keys still in his pocket. His fingers trembled as he reached for them, the metallic jingle of the keychain sounding unnaturally loud in the still night. And then an idea struck him. A terrible, beautiful idea. Charlie turned his gaze to the bikes. A slow smile stretched his busted lips as he slipped into his truck. The engine roared to life, loud and angry in the quiet of the night. The voices in the bar went silent. Then came the shouting. Charlie threw the truck into gear and slammed his foot on the gas. The tires screeched as the truck lunged forward, straight into Pam's precious car. Metal crunched, glass exploded, the impact sending her sedan skidding sideways into the row of motorcycles. The domino effect was glorious. One by one, the bikes went down, a chain reaction of destruction. Chrome bent and shattered. Gas tanks burst. Alarms blared into the night. The sheer violence of it all sent a sick satisfaction surging through Charlie's veins. And then the front door of the bar exploded open. Behemoth and his gang poured out, their faces contorted in rage. Charlie yanked the truck into reverse, backing away from the wreckage. His ribs screamed, but he didn't care. He had taken something from them. And it felt good. "Get him," someone roared. Charlie didn't hesitate. He slammed the gear shift into drive and floored it. Behemoth lunged toward the truck, but Charlie jerked the wheel, clipping him with the side mirror and sending him sprawling. The last thing Charlie saw in his rearview mirror was Pam standing in the wreckage, her hands in her hair, her mouth open in horror. For the first time in months, Charlie Wilson felt something close to joy. But he wasn't safe yet. They were coming. And he was ready. Charlie's hands clenched the steering wheel, knuckles white, breath ragged. The engine of his truck roared as he tore down the desolate highway, his headlights cutting through the inky blackness of the night. Behind him, the glow of approaching motorcycles swelled like fireflies in the rearview mirror. Only these fireflies carried death on their backs. The bikers were coming. Adrenaline surged through his veins, dulling the pain from his broken ribs and bruised flesh. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, competing with the growling engines gaining on him. These men weren't just angry. They were hunting him. He had humiliated them, wrecked their precious bikes, and now they wanted blood. His blood. Charlie forced his truck past 80, then 90 miles per hour, the old engine straining under the pressure. But the bikers were built for speed. They were closing the distance with terrifying ease. The leader, Behemoth, was at the front, his massive frame barely contained by the bike he rode. His beard whipped in the wind, his eyes locked on Charlie with a murderous gleam. Then came the first strike. A biker pulled alongside Charlie's truck on the right, his face twisted in a sadistic grin. He swung a length of chain, the metal links whistling through the air before slamming against the passenger side window. The glass cracked, but held. Charlie jerked the wheel toward him. The biker yelped, veering hard to the side to avoid getting crushed. He lost control for a second, just enough for his front wheel to hit a pothole. The bike wobbled violently before flipping, sending him tumbling across the asphalt like a rag doll. Charlie didn't have time to celebrate. Another biker surged ahead, pulling up to his left. This one wielded a crowbar, holding it high as he prepared to smash Charlie's driver's side window. Charlie made his move. He slammed the brakes. The biker, expecting resistance, wasn't prepared for the sudden stop. He shot past the truck, caught off guard. Charlie yanked the wheel, clipping the bike's rear tire. The machine wobbled, and the biker lost control, skidding sideways before launching into the air. The sickening crunch of metal and bone echoed through the night as he hit the pavement. But Charlie wasn't out of the woods yet. Behemoth was still coming, his engine snarling like a caged beast. And he wasn't alone. 3 more bikers flanked him, their eyes filled with pure rage. Behemoth reached into his vest and pulled out something dark and heavy. A gun. Charlie's stomach dropped. The first shot rang out, shattering his side mirror. He ducked, barely dodging the second bullet as it punched through his windshield. Damn it. A mile ahead, the road curved sharply around a steep ravine. Charlie's mind raced, calculating. If he could time it right. Behemoth was closing in, gun raised again. Charlie made his choice. He wrenched the wheel hard to the right, veering off the road and onto the rocky shoulder. His tires screamed in protest, kicking up dust and gravel as he barely clung to control. The bikers, caught off guard, reacted a second too late. One lost control instantly, his bike hitting a rock and flipping end over end before slamming into a tree. The second tried to adjust, but overcorrected, skidding sideways. His tires caught the edge of the pavement wrong, and he was launched over the handlebars, tumbling into the darkness below. Only Behemoth remained. Charlie's truck fishtailed, but he corrected just in time to take the curve. Behemoth, roaring in fury, didn't hesitate. He followed. The problem? His bike wasn't built for off-road chases. Charlie saw it the moment Behemoth realized his mistake. The massive biker tried to slow down, but his tires hit a patch of loose gravel. His front wheel jerked violently, and then, just like that, he was airborne. Charlie watched in the rearview mirror as Behemoth and his bike flew over the edge of the ravine. For a moment, it looked like he might land it. Then gravity won. The monstrous man disappeared into the darkness, his furious scream swallowed by the abyss below. Silence followed. Charlie, breathing hard, slowed the truck to a crawl. The only sounds now were his own pounding heartbeat and the distant echo of wreckage settling in the ravine. The bikers were gone. He had won. But as he pulled back onto the highway, the pain in his ribs flaring anew, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not yet. Charlie drove with white-knuckled hands, the steering wheel slick with blood and sweat. His body screamed in agony, his ribs grinding with every breath. But he clenched his jaw and forced himself to stay alert. The distant wail of sirens made his pulse quicken. Had the cops found the wreckage? Were they coming for him? The highway stretched out in an endless black ribbon, the yellow lines blurring as exhaustion threatened to drag him under. He slapped himself hard, the sting keeping him grounded. 50 miles. That was how far he needed to go. Centerville had a trauma center, and more importantly, it was a place where no one knew his name. A town where he could disappear. By the time he reached the outskirts, his vision was swimming. His truck had become a coffin of pain, the air thick with a metallic scent of blood. He needed to ditch it fast. He took a winding side road, his headlights sweeping over endless fields, until he spotted Salvation, an old, forgotten barn, its wooden frame half collapsed, a relic of better days. Charlie turned onto the dirt path, killing the lights as he coasted to a stop. He stepped out, biting down a groan, and forced himself forward. The barn doors groaned in protest as he shoved them open. Dust swirled in the moonlight, and the scent of rotting hay filled his nostrils. He didn't have time to be careful. Charlie searched the glove compartment, pulling out his wallet. He flipped it open, staring at the ID he had carried for years. Charlie Wilson, a man who used to believe in love, in trust, in forever. A man who no longer existed. He tore out the ID, his fingers trembling as he ripped it to shreds. The pieces fluttered to the ground, little fragments of a life that had been stolen from him. A new name. That's what he needed. Something forgettable. He grabbed a gas receipt from his pocket. Printed at the top was a generic store slogan: Sam Adams, Fuel and Market. Sam Adams. He let the name roll in his mind. It fit. It was common, unremarkable. Charlie Wilson had died in that bar. Sam Adams would take his place. The drive into town was a blur, the pain swallowing him whole. He found the hospital by instinct alone, its sterile white lights glowing in the darkness. The emergency entrance loomed ahead, and he barely managed to park before his body gave out. By the time the paramedics found him slumped over the steering wheel, his mind was slipping into unconsciousness. "Sir, can you hear me?" A voice asked, sharp and professional. He forced his lips to move. Mugged, highway, don't remember. It was enough. They believed him. The gurney was cold beneath him, the bright hospital lights stabbing through his eyelids as voices swirled around him. Possible broken ribs. Facial contusions, swelling near the left eye. Dehydration. Signs of exhaustion. It didn't matter. Let them think he was just another nameless victim. A nobody. They ran tests, pumped him full of painkillers, and patched him up. He let himself drift, knowing that for the first time in days, he was safe. But safety wouldn't last forever. He had almost dozed off when the curtain around his hospital bed rustled. A man stepped inside, his uniform crisp, his badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. "Mr. Adams?" The officer's voice was calm but firm. "Charlie, no, Sam." Open his eyes. "Yeah." The officer studied him, his expression unreadable. We had a report of a biker crash just outside of town. 8 injured, 2 dead. Witnesses said there was a truck involved. Know anything about that? Charlie's pulse remained steady. He forced himself to frown, playing the part of the confused victim. A biker crash? No. I got jumped on the highway. Woke up a few miles out. The officer held his gaze a moment longer, as if weighing the truth. Then, finally, he nodded. All right. If you remember anything, let us know. Charlie exhaled slowly as the officer walked away. He had made it through. But deep inside, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Charlie parked his new truck a block away from the house, his house. He hadn't been there in over a week, but he didn't feel like he was coming home. Home was supposed to be a place of warmth, of safety, that had been shattered the moment Pam had laughed while he lay broken on a barroom floor. As he walked toward the house, every step felt heavier. His ribs still ached. The bruises on his face had darkened into sickly shades of yellow and purple, and the scabs on his knuckles itched like hell. But none of that compared to the wound inside him, the one she had carved with her betrayal. The porch light was on. She was waiting. Charlie hesitated at the front door, his fingers brushing over the handle. Then, with a slow breath, he pushed it open. Pam sat curled on the couch, wrapped in one of his old hoodies, her legs pulled up against her chest. Her eyes were red, swollen. A glass of wine sat half empty on the coffee table, next to a crumpled tissue. The moment she saw him, she gasped, covering her mouth with both hands. Oh my God, Charlie, her voice cracked. Charlie said nothing. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. She scrambled to her feet, her hands trembling as she reached out, then hesitated, as if realizing she no longer had the right to touch him. I didn't know if you'd ever come back, she whispered. Charlie still said nothing. He just stared at her. It was a strange thing, looking at someone you once loved and realizing they were a stranger. The Pam he had married was gone. Maybe she had never really been there at all. Tears welled in her eyes. Charlie, her voice broke completely, and she buried her face in her hands. But Charlie just stood there, unmoving. Pam sobbed harder. I made a mistake, okay? I was lost. I didn't know what I was doing. Charlie tilted his head slightly. Didn't know what you were doing? His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it. She nodded desperately, stepping closer. Yes, I was stupid. I got caught up in something I didn't understand. I thought. She stopped herself, shaking her head. I don't even know what I thought. I was wrong, Charlie. So wrong. He let out a slow breath through his nose, watching her crumble. There had been a time when her tears would have broken him, when he would have rushed to her, pulled her into his arms, and promised to fix everything. But that man was gone. She stepped closer, her voice growing more frantic. Please, Charlie, I need you. I can't do this without you. Those guys, they're dangerous. I didn't know what I was getting into, and now they don't want me anymore. I have nowhere else to go. There it was. Charlie's lips curled slightly, a ghost of something that might have been a smirk if it weren't so bitter. So, you're not here because you love me, he said. You're here because they threw you away. Pam flinched. No, it's not like that, I swear. I was just having fun. Charlie finished for her. That's what you called it that night, right? Having fun. Her face twisted in pain. I was wrong. I was so wrong. Charlie studied her, the desperation in her eyes, the way her body trembled as she reached for him again, the way she clung to the past, as if she could stitch it back together with just a few apologies. But there was nothing left to save. He stepped forward, so close she could feel the heat from his body. For a brief moment, her eyes flickered with hope. Then he leaned in, his voice a whisper against her ear. I don't love you anymore, Pam, and I never will again. Her breath hitched. She pulled back, her eyes wide with disbelief. Charlie, please. Please don't do this. But he was already walking past her. Every step he took felt lighter. The weight that had been pressing on his chest since the moment he saw her in that biker's lap was gone. At the door, he paused, glancing back one last time. Pam stood frozen in the middle of the living room, her arms wrapped around herself, tears streaming down her face. There had been a time when that sight would have broken him. Not anymore. Without another word, he opened the door and stepped into the night, leaving her sobs behind him. Charlie Wilson had been a fool once. But fools learn. And Charlie? He was never going to be that man again.